The true apostle of the American Constitution was James Madison. Slight, somewhat of a hypochondriac, he was an incredibly hard worker and one of the keenest intellects this country has ever produced. He was a slaveholder who lived in Virginia, and he was part of the Virginia dynasty. Nonetheless, his contributions cannot be overlooked. It is he who is going to shepherd the United States through what is known as the Second War for Independence. Ever since the Revolution, Britain never fully accepted American independence. They always viewed the American nation as a vassal of theirs and would eventually be subservient to them. This is reflected, of course, in the Jay Treaty and the way in which the United States was treated when it came to trading rights with the British. Now, while all this is going on, there is, of course, a little fellow by the name of Napoleon running around Europe. And the United States wanted very badly to stay out of that affair. And they did their very best to do so. But Madison, when he takes over from Jefferson, remember he had been the Secretary of State, and that was the sort of the heir to the throne was the Secretary of State, if we can use a monarchical term in a republic. Madison has to deal with not just the British on his front, but also Indians on his back, especially two Shawnee brothers. And then the War of 1812, which will result in the first and only invasion of the continental United States by a foreign power. And then we'll go down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico, which of course means New Orleans, the great battle that takes place there on January the 8th, 1815. And then finally, the Treaty of Ghent, which ends the war between the United States and Britain. With war waging in Europe between Britain and France, Napoleon and the Allies against him, the Americans sought very strongly to follow the advice of Washington and stay out. Neither Britain nor France honored that neutrality. They believed that the Americans had a role to play, and especially when it came to shipping. For the British Navy, for the Royal Navy in Britain, the biggest issue between them and the Americans was the impressment of sailors. That is, the forcible removing of sailors from American ships and placing them onto British ships of the line. Now, many of those that they impressed were deserters from the British Navy. And so there was sort of a grievance that the British had against the American Navy. However, when an American ship is flying the American flag on the high seas, that is sovereign territory. You don't touch that. And the British are violating that. In response to the growing impressment problem, Jefferson passed the Embargo Act of 1807 when the Chesapeake, an American ship, was boarded and soldiers were pressed. He forbade all trade with foreign ports. Well, this simply caused an economic depression, and it really hurt the merchants of the Northeast, who were members of the Federalist Party, who did not like Jefferson in the least. But also the farmers of the South and West also suffered. But Jefferson, master of public relations that he was, managed to blame the British for this rather than himself. This has something of an echo going on right now with the Iran situation, but it's hardly, the current president is hardly able to shield himself from the criticism the way that Jefferson was able to do so. Jefferson left office in 1809, adhering to the two-term principle set down by George Washington. In 1808, the Democratic Republican Party and the Federalists began nominating their own candidates. The leader for the Democratic Republicans, or the Republicans of the time, and this is not to be confused with the Republican Party of today, is James Madison, the Secretary of State under Jefferson. The Federalists choose Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, who had helped create the Pinckney Treaty. The Tertium Quids tried to enlist James Monroe, but Monroe declined because Madison had promised him the Secretary of State position, which meant, of course, that he would then be next in line for the presidency. A fraction or a fragment of the Democratic Republican Party broke off and nominated George Clinton, the governor of New York. This is more of the Aaron Burr group. Madison wins in a large electoral landslide. And Madison decides not to renew the charter of the National Bank. That was far too Hamiltonian for Jefferson and Madison, and they were not about to renew that charter. So the First National Bank comes to an end. Madison is also trying very diligently to assert American authority in the face of British aggression. There's national prestige at stake. He has passed and signs the Non-Intercourse Act of 1809 to forbid trade with the British, so the embargo goes only to the British at that point. Since the Revolutionary War, the Indian tribes of the Northwest and the West had been very quiet, but still very resentful. Among them rose two brothers of the Shawnee Nation. The younger of them was Tenskwatawa. He is called the Prophet. Oftentimes, the Indians will go through these revival movements where they will decide that they need to go back and they need to reclaim their tribal identity. They need to avoid alcohol, which had been a scourge for the Indian tribes. They needed to adhere to the old tribal customs. We're going to see this again in the 1880s. Tenskwatawa preached nonviolence. He established a community on Tippecanoe Creek called Prophetstown. His older brother was Tecumseh. Now, you've heard that name, Tecumseh, before. It's going to be the middle name of one of the greatest American generals in the country's history, William Tecumseh Sherman. This is from whom he gets his middle name. Tecumseh was not nonviolent. He was a warrior. He sought alliances among the Indian tribes and armed resistance to white settlers who were continuing to move Indians out. Tecumseh certainly was talking to the British. Tenskwatawa was not. But Americans considered the brothers agents of the European powers, especially Britain. Why do countries go to war? There's a question that really needs examination when you look at this country. Why are we waging a war to this very day? Why did we wage a war in 1812? Well, first of all, you have to do the math on it. It's 1812. The Revolutionary War ended in 1783. That's 30 years. That's a generation. Now, people go to war for territory. They go to war for economics. They go to war for religion. They go to war for a variety of reasons. But at its very base, they go to war for manhood. Here you have a new breed of politician, men who were younger than the old revolutionaries. Remember, the old revolutionaries are old men now. They're telling stories by the fire. And of course, as time goes on, the stories become more and more exaggerated. And the younger generation sees the older generation and says, boy, these men came of age during the war. They became men during the war. Therefore, I think what we need is a war, and this will mark us as a generation. Understand, we have a much different approach toward war today, although not so much as we sometimes find out. And so you have these new revolutionary politicians. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, just 30 years old. 35-year-old Daniel Webster of New Hampshire. Henry Clay of Kentucky. Richard Mentor Johnson of Virginia. And William Henry Harrison of Ohio, who besieged Prophetstown and destroyed it at the Battle of Tippecanoe Creek. These men are called the War Hawks. They want to go to war with Britain. They want to seize Canada, take that away, take that spur out of the side of the United States. They felt a war would spur trade, it would secure the old Northwest, and most importantly, it would define them as strong men of their generation. They served a war. Do the math on the wars in this country. 1783. The Revolutionary War ends. 1812, the War of 1812 begins. That's 30 years. The next big war that we fight will be 1846. 31 years after the War of 1812 comes to an end. The Mexican War. Then you have the Civil War, which a little shorter interval. The next war after the Civil War is 30 years later. The Spanish-American War. And then World War I and World War II, and then 30 years after World War II, there's Vietnam. 30 years after Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan. It's a generational thing. It is not coincidental. Now let's get back to 1812. The country signs the Fort Wayne Treaty, in which, once again, the United States government manages to pull the wool over the Indian chiefs' eyes. They sell off the lands belonging to other tribes, playing tribes against each other, and Tecumseh denounced it. He said, "This is ridiculous. We are fighting each other when we should be fighting the common enemy of the white Americans." Here are your major war hawks, clockwise from the top left. Young John C. Calhoun, an ardent nationalist. He is Secretary of War under Madison. Henry Clay of Kentucky. He is one of the ones that beats the drum loudest for this war. The handsome Daniel Webster of New Hampshire. Richard Mentor Johnson, bottom right, of Virginia, and young William Henry Harrison of Ohio, the victor of Tippecanoe Creek, and for that he would be called Old Tippecanoe. It is Calhoun who will actually file the declaration of war with Congress. It is not a unanimous vote. The Federalists are not in favor of this war at all. So it's a very split and uneven vote. And that is going to be the case for many of the wars we go into. World War II is the exception because of Pearl Harbor. But even prior to World War II, there was a great deal of division about whether the United States should be in this war. The opening campaigns of the war, neither Britain nor the United States were ready for this war. Britain was very occupied with Napoleon at the time. The United States did not have a large standing army. We didn't like that sort of thing. That got in the way of our liberties. The war is going to be fought in several theaters. On the Canadian border and the Great Lakes. It'll be fought on the high seas. And it'll be fought in the Chesapeake region, especially around Baltimore and Washington. And then the final campaigns of the war will be in the South. You see here the cartoon, Brother Jonathan versus John Bull. Brother Jonathan is, of course, the United States. John Bull is Britain, as they are trying to force things on each other. When it came to the region of Canada and the Great Lakes, the American strategy was to start operations on the western frontier and then move over to the St. Lawrence Valley, capture Montreal and Quebec, and cut that valley. If anything marks the American experience on the Canada Great Lakes front, it is inexperience. It is incompetence. It is disaster. For instance, General William Hull surrendered Fort Detroit without a fight because the British convinced him that their force of 2,000 was actually closer to 20,000. They then fought the Battle of Queenstown Heights, and this was a British victory. Then the Americans tried to go up Lake Champlain. Of course, that's the alleyway into Canada and from Canada. The Americans have pushed back yet again, and now Canada is basically secure from an American invasion. And trying to cross Lake Ontario, the Americans now attack the city of York. York's name today is Toronto, one of the largest cities in all of Canada. They burned the city to the ground, and Zebulon Pike was killed by an explosion when the ammo dump went up. The British saw the burning of York as an atrocity, and they were going to get their revenge on the Americans for it. There is also a hero on the Great Lakes, and that is Oliver Hazard Perry. He is the one who turns the defeat into victory on Lake Erie at Put-in Bay. He also has several young cabin boys with them, one of which is his younger brother, Matthew. Matthew is the man who, in the early 1850s, will go to Japan and open up Japan to Western trade. Another cabin boy serving in the war was one David Glasgow Farragut, who would later be the one to capture the city of New Orleans during the American Civil War. Where the campaigns along the Canadian border and the Great Lakes were disasters and the height of incompetence for American commanders. The high seas was a totally different story. This is where the small United States Navy begins to shine. Three of the great six frigates that the United States commissioned now see action: the USS President, the USS United States, under the command of Stephen Decatur of the Barbary War fame, and of course the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, commanded by Isaac Hull. The Constitution is the one that really shines forward, although the other frigates do well also. They capture the HMS Macedonian from the British. They sink the Java off the coast of Brazil, and then there is the great experience against the Guerriere off the coast of Spain and France, in which the Constitution actually has to fire the anchor out into the water several times and then pull on it because there's no wind that they can use to get away from the British. And then they lure the British in and they sink the ship. In the war at sea, the British had 97 vessels working in American waters, blockading the American coast. The United States had only 22 commissioned vessels. That means that most of these vessels were retrofitted. They were all cargo vessels that had cannons put on them. Only the 6 frigates were actual warships. The British goals were simple: protect the shipping lanes to and from Nova Scotia and blockade the American coast. The Americans, as you can tell, very badly outnumbered, decided that they would go to a hit and run, capture vessels where necessary, and most importantly, employ privateers. And to this effect, the city of Baltimore was the hub of privateer activity. Now, a privateer is a sailor who carries from a government a letter of marque. And a letter of marque basically says, you're a pirate, and you have a license by this country to be a pirate for this country. And that's why they call it a privateer. This is an artist's depiction of the Constitution engaging the Guerriere at close quarters. You don't see this type of battle anymore. Everything is from a distance, radar. This is the type of thing that we don't do in the Strait of Hormuz anymore. For the first time in the history of this country, a presidential election would be held in the middle of a war. This is a major test of the U.S. Constitution because the Constitution was supposed to survive both in peace and in wartime. And the United States does have its presidential election, and Madison records a victory again, but it's a narrow victory because the Federalists who are against this war gain in Congress. On the backside of the Americans were many of the Indian nations, like the Shawnees and the Creeks, long the allies of the British, dating back to the French and Indian War and the Revolution. Creeks moved against Fort Mims, and there they massacred 300 settlers. The Tennessee militia then rallies around Andrew Jackson, who is an American colonel who is a regular commander in the Army. And there weren't many Army officers at the time. Jackson is one of them. And Jackson, who has almost a biblical fury, then massacres the Red Sticks at Horseshoe Bend. Of course, he massacred the wrong group of Red Sticks rather than the ones that actually perpetrated the Fort Mims massacre. And of course, the name for the Red Sticks is in French, Baton Rouge. So this is a map that shows the path that Jackson is going to take in 1814, where he's going to massacre the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend. Jackson is ardently anti-Creek for a number of reasons. And then he will travel his way down south to New Orleans. It was becoming quite evident to both the Americans and the British that this war was turning into a stalemate. And the British were really having problems with Napoleon at the time. And so the British began to send out feelers to offer peace. Madison, in response, then sends a peace commission with Henry Clay, Albert Gallatin, and the leader of the peace commission, John Quincy Adams, to Ghent in Belgium. And there they begin negotiations for an end to the war, because the war is now causing a decline in the American economy. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Madison signs the embargo of 1813 and makes all trading ships confined to port. It gives vast discretionary powers to customs agents and the Navy, and it even further handicaps the American economy. The hub of privateer activity was Baltimore in the Chesapeake. By 1814, the British are now ready to bring their full force to bear against the American nation because Napoleon has been defeated, deposed, and sent to the island of Elba. And now they conceive of a three-pronged offensive through Canada, along the Atlantic coast, and then seize New Orleans and the mouth of the Mississippi. The British land in Maryland in 1814, and there they win the Battle of Bladensburg, which leaves the path to Washington open. Washington is abandoned and evacuated. Washington has no strategic value as far as any sort of a road crossing or an important port. It is simply the seat of the nation's government, and it's not much of a city at this time. In fact, it won't be much of a city until the late 1800s, but it does have the buildings of government and so forth. It is left open. Madison leaves the capital. He leaves his wife behind in the capital because she wants to make sure that the paintings and things are saved. The British then go into Washington, and in response for the burning of York, Toronto, they burn the Capitol, they burn the White House, they burn the Library of Congress. There is one building they do not burn, the Patent Office. And the reason that they do not burn the Patent Office is because the British have a high respect for science, and they did not want to burn scientific innovations. And so the Patent Office becomes the de facto Capitol building of the United States until the others are repaired. As a matter of fact, the scorch marks on the White House are kept from those days when the White House was being refurbished back in the 1950s. Harry S. Truman kept them there in order to show the British ambassador the scorch marks. Washington, as I said, nothing strategic about it. It was simply prestige. By the way, the commander that ordered the firing of Washington was shot in the head on his way to Baltimore as the British began marching on Baltimore. There you see the burned out shells of both the Capitol in the upper left and the White House in the lower right. And based on what the artist shows, you can see that Washington is simply not a very big or important town at the time. It's where the government sat, and that was basically it. The real prize was Baltimore. And here the British have a two-pronged offensive to land at North Point, where the Americans do repulse the British. And in this is where many African Americans and whites were digging trenches side by side to defend the city. And then, of course, is the famous sea campaign against Fort McHenry toward the inner harbor. The Battle of Fort McHenry, the British are unable to reduce the fort. This is, of course, the famous Star-Spangled Banner, the banner yet wave, and so forth. The commander of the American forces at Baltimore was a fellow by the name of Joseph Armistead. And Armistead's nephew later, Lewis Armistead, would be the one who would lead Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg. With Baltimore safe, the British leave that harbor and turn their focus south toward New Orleans. An incredibly artistic but not very accurate depiction of the bombardment of Fort McHenry, which of course went on during the night, not during the day. And that is Fort McHenry today, restored with the embankments, the walls, and the inner buildings. We, of course, know the famous story of the lawyer Francis Scott Key, who was on a British ship trying to secure the release of an American hostage. And having to stay on the ship during the battle, during the evening, seeing the fort not reduced. He therefore wrote the famous Star Spangled Banner. But one should go ahead and look at the whole song rather than just the part we use for our national anthem. And you will see that there is a little bit of white supremacy involved in the entire song. And now there comes to the forefront in the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson. Born in the South Carolina backcountry, he was a descendant of Scots-Irish immigrants that came over from Northern Ireland into the backcountry of South Carolina, then moved to Tennessee eventually. When he was 13 years old, he and his older brother were captured by the British and put into a miserable prison camp where he defended his wounded and sick brother from the beatings that the British and the Creeks gave to them. His brother eventually died, and this severely marked him. It probably caused him such a psychological issue that he became a psychopath. He had an unholy temper, and he hated the Creeks, and he hated the British with an absolute biblical vengeance. His soldiers called him Old Hickory. They did not like him, they did not love him, but they respected him. He was tough on them to the point of mean, but he was absolutely courageous in battle, and he was a good leader. It is he that is now going to command the American forces at the city of New Orleans. In 1957, Johnny Horton wrote a song called The Battle of New Orleans. It was the #1 hit when it was released. And one of the verses in it is down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. The Battle of New Orleans featured the first truly multicultural army in history, the American Citizen Army, which consisted of regular American troops, Tennessee militia, Creole French that were in Louisiana, free men of color that were in Louisiana, Choctaw Indians who were allies of the Americans, Baratarian pirates led by Jean Lafitte, the dashing debonair pirate privateer who traded in all sorts of goods and slaves. And let's not leave out Irish, not Scots-Irish, but Irish from the south of Ireland, called themselves the Louisiana Blues. Blue was actually the color of Ireland before it became green. The commanders for the British, Sir Edward Michael Pakenham. He is the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington. He's an excellent soldier, an excellent organizer, very brave in battle, and of course, Andrew Jackson, whom I have spoken about previously. The Battle of New Orleans takes place over a series of days, but it climaxes on January the 8th, 1815. The British outnumbered the Americans 8-1. But despite this British numerical superiority, it was a decisive American victory. First of all, minor battles that Jackson conducted on Lake Borgne and south and east of Chalmette allowed Jackson to solidify his defensives. The Americans held the best defensive positions along what was called the Rodriguez Canal or Line Jackson behind earthworks and cotton bales and so forth. The biggest problem, though, is that the British were fighting in European style. They were coming in rows, they were blowing their bagpipes, firing in rows, they were wearing red. The Americans were using the Kentucky long rifle, they were using artillery that the Baratarian pirates had mastered the art of, and that the Americans were able to force the British into the narrow ground between the swamps and the Mississippi River. Of course, there's an irony to this battle, and the irony of the battle is this. The main battle fought on January the 8th took place 2 weeks after the peace treaty was signed at Ghent. In other words, the battle was really not necessary. There's a great story where Jackson, who had declared martial law, actually threw a newspaper reporter in prison. The newspaper reporter then had a lawyer go to a judge to get released from the prison. Jackson threw the judge into prison. Well, once the word of the peace treaty finally reached New Orleans in March, Jackson released the judge and the reporter. The judge, who was still in his robes in the jail, went right back to the court and fined Jackson $1,000. Jackson was many things, but he was honest, and he was a lawyer himself. And he looked at the law and he realized that he had thrown the judge and the newspaper reporter in jail after the peace treaty had been signed, which meant that martial law was invalid. He paid the fine. Jackson's name was not well regarded in New Orleans right after the battle, but by the time of the Civil War, his name was now really well regarded because he had preserved the Union during his time in office. This is a battle map of the attack of the British on Line Jackson, or the Rodriguez Canal. And you can see that with north to the right, the Mississippi south to the left, west toward New Orleans at the top, and east on the bottom. You see where the British made their main attack right along the Rodriguez Canal and then were repulsed. Along the way, British General Pakenham tried to ride into battle to rally his troops, and he was shot down and killed. His body then was put into a cask of rum and was shipped back to Ireland, where he was buried, because he was a member of the Anglo-Irish, that is, English who were born in Ireland. The British retreated in very good order, especially the Scottish Highlanders, who were incredibly well disciplined, so much so that the Irish troops along the canal, who pushed them back, gave them a rousing salute for their professionalism. 2 weeks earlier, the Treaty of Ghent had been signed. The American negotiators were John Quincy Adams, and this is really his coming out party. He is the son of John Adams, and he is a close ally of both Jefferson and Madison, despite the fact that his father was politically their opponent. Henry Clay, James Bayard, Albert Gallatin, the treasurer that had served under Jefferson and now Madison, and Jonathan Russell. The treaty was signed on Christmas Eve, 1814. In the end, the war was almost a complete stalemate. All pre-war boundaries were restored. All prisoners were released. Britain promised to return captured slaves because, once again, this war became a huge slave uprising. But instead of giving back the slaves, paid the U.S. 250,000 pounds for them. This war is important because from this point onward, the United States and Britain aren't going to become friends just yet. That really doesn't happen until about a century later. But it does lead to a general thawing of relations with Britain. Britain, more or less, now begins to accept the fact of American independence. And the Americans begin to accept the fact of British presence in Canada. And so this sort of is a Cold War at first, but then they normalize their relations in 1818 and say, we're not going to do war anymore, we're going to have diplomacy. And there's rocky parts along. The Civil War was a big rocky part. But for the most part, this is the beginning of the warming of relations with Great Britain, to the point where today, of course, we have what's called the special relationship. And here you see the British and the American delegates shaking hands in the cloakroom, or the meeting room of Ghent in Belgium. That is Quincy Adams shaking hands with the British negotiator. Gallatin stands right behind him, and you see peeking out in the back Henry Clay, who really wanted nothing to do with it, but he was there on orders of Madison. You started it, now you got to get us out of it.